Dawn on October 25th, 1415 doesn't arrive in gold. It arrives in ash-gray light, heavy and low, like the sky itself has come down to watch. Stand with me here, close enough to hear the wet leather creak, close enough to see the steam of breath slip out through helmet gaps. We're wedged between two dark lines of woodland in northern France. Ahead is a field that was plowed and seeded not long ago, now churned into a ribbon of slick mud by last night's rain. It isn't just ground, it feels like a living thing, hungry to hold on to every boot, every hoof, every man who tries to move across it. Behind me, the English line stretches in tight ranks, men at arms in steel, archers in damp wool, faces drawn with fatigue. They've marched too far on too little food, carrying a campaign on their backs like a burden that never gets lighter. Their eyes keep flicking forward, not because they want glory, but because they need to know what's coming. And what's coming is France, more men than we have, more shining armor than we can count at a glance. Through the fog and drizzle, their line looks like a wall of metal, banners layered behind banners, horses breathing clouds into the cold. I tighten my grip on my sword, not because I'm eager for the moment, because I'm afraid of it. People like to believe kings don't feel fear, that a crown turns a man into stone. It doesn't. A crown turns fear into something heavier, something that sits on your chest even when you're standing straight. I'm Henry, born in Monmouth, raised between borders, forged by rebellions. To history, I'm Henry V. To the men behind me, I have to be more than a name. I have to be a promise. Because the truth is simple. My father took the throne. Some called it rescue, some called it theft. And when a dynasty begins with a question mark, every day that follows is a test. If I fall here, it won't just be a battlefield that goes quiet. It will be England's confidence. It will be the fragile story of Lancaster legitimacy, shaken, mocked, hunted by old enemies and new claimants. So I keep my shoulders square. I keep my voice steady. I keep the fear where it belongs, inside. Listen, you can hear it if you stop thinking and just stand here. The low murmur of prayers, the quick, efficient thuds of wooden stakes being driven into the earth, the soft clatter of arrowheads as archers check their sheaves, the distant, restless shifting of French cavalry, the wind pushing at wet cloth and snapping at banners like it wants to tear them from their poles. And in that wind, I swear I hear something else, a whisper. Monmouth. It's absurd, of course. Wind makes strange music through steel and trees. But memory is its own kind of battlefield, and mine is full of old stories, whale stories, tales of a red dragon sleeping in the mountains, tales of storms that choose kings, tales of saints and omens, and a land that never fully belongs to anyone who claims it. I don't say this aloud, not to any captain, not to any priest, but for a breath of time, I feel as if history itself has stepped close and placed a hand on my shoulder. Not to grant victory, not to do the fighting for us, but to remind me what today is. A verdict. I glance down at the ground again. The mud glistens in the thin light. It clings to boots. It swallows footsteps. It turns courage into exhaustion and speed into stumbling. And suddenly, the field makes more sense than the numbers. Men talk about armies as if they're math, as if more always means stronger. But today the rules are written by weather, terrain, and discipline. This mud will punish weight. It will punish haste. It will punish pride. I look out toward the French host, and I can almost feel their confidence rolling across the field, pressing towards us like a tide. They believe this should be simple. They believe they've cornered an English king with a tired army. They believe they can end this in one overwhelming push. Let them believe it. I turn slightly, letting my gaze sweep back over my own line. These men are not perfect. They're hungry. They're cold. Some are still sick from the march, but they're here. They held together through weeks of hardship. They obeyed when it would have been easier to break apart. And that, more than steel, is what keeps a line from collapsing. On the flanks, the archers stand with longbows held close, strings protected, arrows kept dry as they can manage. Their hands are steady, not because they lack fear, but because repetition has made their bodies reliable. They've planted their stakes, sharp points angled outward like teeth, a wooden hedge meant to break the force of a charge. This isn't a storybook duel, it's a system. Across the field, the French formations shift. Armor glints in patches where the fog thins. A horse stamps and slides slightly, its rider correcting with a tight pull in a tense seat. Even at this distance, you can sense it. Not unity, but crowding. Not calm, but impatience. Too many commanders, too many banners, too many men who expect the world to move out of their way. Time stretches, the kind of time that feels like a held breath. Neither side wants to be the first to move. There are rules, rituals, ideas about honor. But honor doesn't feed hungry men, and it doesn't keep a kingdom from unraveling. I think of England, of Westminster, of stone halls and quiet councils, of the long shadow of my father's reign. I think of the throne that can never again look weak. I think of every noble who is watching to see if I'm truly a king or merely a fortunate heir. And I decide that waiting is more dangerous than moving. I step forward, just one pace, feeling the mud pull at my boots before releasing with a wet, reluctant sound. It's a small movement, but it ripples outward. Captains tighten their grips, lines adjust, arrows look towards me, not for courage, but for timing. My breath fogs in the slit of my visor. I speak softly to myself, so soft it's almost a prayer. Don't look at their armor, look at the ground. The ground will decide. I raise my arm, firm, economical, unmistakable. No flourish, no speech. The men don't need poetry right now. They need a signal they can trust. The archers lift their bows. Wood bends, strings tighten, bodies settle into stance. Feet dig in, shoulders align. For a heartbeat, the world feels perfectly still, as if even the rain is waiting to see what I will do. Then I lower my hand, and the sky fills with arrows. Not one or two, but a dark rising cloud, shafts cutting upward through the gray, vanishing into mist, then arcing toward the French line like a judgment written in flight. The first volley is more than a weapon, it's a statement. It says, we will not stand here and be measured like cattle. We will not be pressed into surrender by numbers alone. We will choose the moment. We will choose the ground. We will choose the rhythm of what happens next. In front of us, the French react, shields lifting, horses tensing, lines shifting as the first impacts land. The fog stirs, the mud waits. And somewhere underneath it all, the field seems to breathe, as if it has been hungry for this moment. Hold your place beside me, because now the story is no longer about marching or diplomacy or claims written on parchment. Now it's about whether a young king, born on a border, raised in unrest, crowned under a blizzard, can make destiny hold firm on a morning made of mud and steel. I was born on the edge of a kingdom, where England fades into Wales and the ground itself feels undecided. My first breath was drawn at Monmouth Castle on September 16, 1386. If you've ever seen a marcher fortress, you'll understand what that means. Monmouth wasn't built for comfort, it was built to endure. Thick stone, narrow windows, damp wind coming off the river, and watchmen who never fully relax. Even as a child, I could feel it. This place didn't whisper lullabies, it whispered warnings. My father was Henry Bolingbroke, royal blood, yes, but also a man forged by travel, tournament, and the hard education of court politics. He was cultured in the way true nobles often were. He read and wrote, he loved music, he spoke the languages expected of power. But culture never made him gentle, it made him prepared. My mother was Mary de Bohun, and when I speak of her, I don't speak like a chronicler. I speak like a son who remembers the shape of a voice more than the shape of a face. Mary came from old aristocratic lands, and with her came a quieter kind of strength, one that belonged to books, prayers, and the steady rhythm of household life. In the rooms where she sat, there were manuscripts, songs, and the soft discipline of learning. I grew up with the sense that a crown is not only iron and gold, it is also ink, music, and manners. But that world didn't last. My mother died when I was still young, before my childhood could stretch out into something safe. After that, the halls felt colder, the harp sounded farther away, and the people around me began to treat my future like a map they were already unfolding on a table. Estates, alliances, claims, rival bloodlines. Because my father's life, and therefore mine, was always shadowed by one question: who should inherit England? The king at the time, Richard II, sat on the throne with the pride of a man who believed power belonged to him by nature. He loved splendor, ceremony, and the idea of kingship. But beneath that brilliance, there was something brittle. Richard could not bear threats, and he saw threats everywhere, especially in my father. Bolingbroke was the grandson of Edward III through John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster. That connection gave him stature, it gave him influence, and to an anxious king it looked like a blade hidden behind silk. When I was 12, the storm finally broke. In 1398, Richard exiled my father, and I, still a boy, was kept behind, not as a prisoner in chains, but as a hostage, a living guarantee. This was not unusual in the medieval world, but understanding that doesn't soften it. A hostage is not held for what he has done, he is held for what someone else might do. People later painted this as a tale of cruelty. The truth is more complicated. Richard treated me properly, even kindly at times. I ate well, I was educated, I was not beaten, but that was never the point. The point was the message. Your father's freedom depends on his obedience, because you are here. Every corridor I walked, every door that closed behind me, taught me a lesson I would never forget. Power doesn't always announce itself with swords. Sometimes it's a quiet lock turning. Sometimes it's the knowledge that your life is a coin being held between two fingers. And then, in 1399, my grandfather John of Gaunt died. Richard seized Lancaster lands, pushing my father toward a choice that no proud noble could ignore. Bolingbroke returned to England that summer. At first, he claimed he only wanted what was his by right. But England was restless, and the political nation had grown tired of Richard's rule. My father didn't return to an empty shore. He returned to a wave. Men flocked to him. Great lords who had smiled at Richard's court now watched the wind change and decided their loyalty could change too. Towns opened gates. Crowds cheered. Not because they loved my father as a person, most didn't know him, but because he represented something Richard had lost: confidence. And suddenly, the kingdom moved faster than any boy could understand. Richard was deposed, the crown was offered, and my father accepted it. Henry Bolingbroke became Henry IV. It was the first major overthrow of an English king in generations, and everyone knew it would not settle cleanly. A throne taken by force is never simply taken. It must be defended, justified, and dressed in the language of God and law until people believe it was always meant to be. I was brought out of hostagehood and placed back into the center of power, but nothing felt like safety anymore. Because now, I wasn't merely a noble boy. I was the heir to a contested crown. On October 13th, 1399, the day of my father's coronation, I walked into Westminster Abbey as part of the ritual that would reshape England. The Abbey was a forest of stone and candlelight, voices echoing under the arches, incense curling in the air. That day, I carried the sword of justice, heavy in my hands, heavier in what it meant. I was 13 years old, and I carried a symbol that told the realm: the new dynasty has a future, the new king has a son, the line will continue. And in that moment, I understood something that most boys never need to understand. Your body becomes a sign. Your youth becomes a statement. Even your steps are political. Soon after, my titles stacked up like armor plates: Prince of Wales, Duke of Cornwall, Earl of Chester, heir of Lancaster's wealth. Each title sounded like honor. Each one was also a responsibility. Estates had to be managed, revenues had to be gathered, retainers had to be kept loyal. And while the ink was still drying on my father's reign, Wales began to burn. That part of my story belongs to another chapter. But even here, in the moment of coronation and restoration, you can feel it coming. Because a usurpation does not end conflict, it invites it. Walking through the palace after the ceremony, I could see it in people's eyes. Some looked at me with hope. Some looked at me like a problem waiting to happen. And some, quiet, watchful, looked at me as if they were already measuring how easily a young heir could be removed if the dynasty faltered. So I learned to move carefully, to listen before speaking, to show calm even when my stomach tightened. I learned that a prince must look inevitable, because if you ever look uncertain, the realm will test you. There's a strange thing about being born in a border fortress and then growing up as a royal hostage and then carrying a sword in a coronation.
It does something to the way you see the world. You stop believing in stability as a natural state. You begin to treat stability as work, something built day by day, like stone laid on stone. And standing there, newly made Prince of Wales, I looked west, towards the marches, towards the hills, towards the places where English authority was always thinner, and I felt the pull of what was coming. Not adventure, not glory, duty. Because by the time I was free again, by the time I could truly call myself my father's son in public, England was no longer a kingdom at rest. It was a kingdom holding its breath, waiting to see if Henry IV could keep what he had taken, and whether I, Henry of Monmouth, could someday make that crown feel unquestioned. I didn't know it yet, but the boy who once stared at locked doors as a hostage was already becoming the man who one day would stand before armies and refuse to yield. And it started here, at Monmouth, at court, and under the cold candlelight of Westminster, when my life stopped being my own and became the future of a dynasty.
Wales didn't raise me the way a palace would have. Wales raised me the way a storm raises a coastline, by wearing it down, reshaping it, and leaving it harder than before. When my father took the crown in 1399, England didn't suddenly become calm. It only changed the name on the banners. The real test began on the western edge of the realm, where English rule had always felt thin and contested. And in the year 1400, the fire finally caught. Owen Glyndwr, Welsh noble, rebel leader, and to many in Wales, something closer to a chosen figure, lifted his standard and called men to him. To my father's council in London, it was a rebellion. To the Marcher lords, it was a threat to land and order. But when I first looked into the hills and valleys where his supporters moved, I understood something deeper. Wales wasn't simply resisting taxes or governors. Wales was resisting a story that had been forced onto it for generations. I was still young, but my titles already made me the face of English authority in the West. And the West taught me quickly. You can't govern a borderland by pretending it's the center. At first, the war felt like chasing smoke. Glyndwr's men knew the mountains, the forests, the narrow lanes that swallow horses and wagons. They would strike, vanish, and leave behind only the echo of hoofbeats and the uneasy silence of villages that didn't know which side would return next. And that's when I learned the first lesson of real command, one no tournament ever teaches you. A campaign isn't decided only by courage. It's decided by bread, boots, and coin. London could argue about policy all day, but out here, if the wagons didn't arrive, the war stopped. If the pay didn't come, men drifted away. If the bowstrings got wet and no one had spare linen to protect them, the advantage vanished. I had soldiers who would follow me into danger, yet even the bravest man cannot eat bravery. There were mornings when I stood over a map and realized the map was lying. Not because the ink was wrong, but because it didn't show the truth. The weight of mud on a boot, the time lost waiting for supplies, the fragile thread that connected a commander in Wales to a treasury in London. I wrote to my father more than once asking, sometimes pleading, for funds, and those letters were humiliating in a way a battlefield never was. On a battlefield, you can at least pretend the struggle is noble, but asking for funds is admitting the simplest reality. Without silver, even a king's son is only a man with hungry soldiers. That pressure also revealed something else, how quickly allies can become dangerous when they believe the crown is failing them. Sir Henry Percy, Hotspur, had trained me. He was a great lord, a fierce soldier, and for a time, a pillar of my father's reign. But frustration over money, over strategy, over respect, those things boiled, and Hotspur turned his anger into open rebellion against my father in 1403. I learned then that loyalty is not a permanent possession. It is a living thing. It must be fed, protected, and sometimes tested, because when it breaks, it doesn't crack politely, it shatters. That rebellion ended at Shrewsbury, where I fought and took an arrow to the face and kept going. And after that, Wales became even more central to my life, not just as a battlefield, but as a school. Because I began to see that my father's approach, though often necessary, wasn't working. The crown lacked money, so his men relied on quick strikes, raids, and constant movement, trying to keep pressure on the rebels without committing to expensive sieges.
But Glyndor wasn't the man who could be worn down by chasing him in circles. He needed space, strongholds, and the belief that time was on his side. So I changed the rhythm. Instead of hunting shadows, I started taking anchors. Castles, fortified towns, strong points that controlled roads and rivers, places that could hold supplies, shelter troops, and deny my enemy the feeling of safety. It was slow, it was costly, but it was a kind of pressure that didn't disappear when the rebels disappeared into the hills. It stayed, it narrowed their options, it tightened the world around them. In 1405, we struck hard enough to win real engagements, at Grosmont and at Usk, and we captured one of Glyndor's sons. Those weren't final victories, but they were signals, proof that the tide could turn. Then came the siege of Aberystwyth, starting in 1407 and ending the year after. Aberystwyth mattered because it connected Wales to the sea, to allies, to hope. When it fell, even the French, who had flirted with supporting the Welsh cause, began to pull back. Not because they suddenly loved England, but because they could read a shifting balance. And then Harlech. Harlech Castle was not just stone, it was an idea, a fortress perched above sea winds and legend. By 1408, it became a final gathering point for what remained of Glyndor's inner circle. Inside those walls were not only Welsh leaders, but also Edmund Mortimer, the man whose bloodline could threaten Lancaster's claim to the English throne. That's what made Harlech more than a Welsh stronghold. It was a knot of rebellion and dynastic danger tied together. We laid siege, we tightened the ring. It took months, and when Harlech finally fell in 1409, Mortimer died during the siege, and Glyndor slipped away into the mountains with a handful of loyal men. After that, he became more rumor than commander. People spoke of him as if he had become part of the landscape, like mist over the ridges or a voice in the wind. Some claimed he would return when Wales needed him most. Others insisted he was already dead. I never found his body. History rarely gives you that kind of clean ending. But I knew what had happened. The rebellion had lost its spine. Wales had forced me to become something more than a prince in ceremonial robes. It forced me to learn how to keep men together when everything around them tried to pull them apart. It taught me that a commander must be both warrior and accountant, both symbol and planner. It taught me that mercy can be strategy, that discipline can be strength, and that the land itself, mud, hills, rivers, weather, can be either enemy or ally depending on whether you respect it. And it also taught me something quieter, something I carried long after the last fortress fell. When you fight a people on their own ground, you begin to understand them. Not necessarily to agree with them, but to see them as human, not as a slogan. I saw Welsh families living under the same rain and hunger that my own soldiers endured. I saw villages that wanted only to survive, caught between banners. I learned that if I ever meant to rule beyond England, if I ever meant to claim France, then conquest could not only be an act of force, it had to become an act of governance. Because in the end, a king isn't measured by how loudly he can win. He is measured by what remains after the noise fades. Wales was where I learned that lesson. It was my crucible, my proving ground, the place where the boy from Monmouth stopped being a hostage of circumstance and started becoming a man who could shape circumstance. And when the day came that I would cross the sea and face France, I carried Wales with me, not as a memory of victory, but as a warning. A crown is never truly won on a single day. It is won slowly, by choices made when no one is watching, choices about discipline, about money, about patience, and about the kind of fear you refuse to show.
The summer of 1403 didn't feel like summer for long. The air around Shrewsbury was heavy, the kind of gray warmth that sits on your skin and makes armor feel twice its weight. Across open fields and hedgerows, two English armies faced each other, Lancaster against Percy, father and son on one side, and the man who had once trained me on the other. That's the thing people forget when they talk about medieval wars. Sometimes the enemy isn't foreign. Sometimes the enemy knows your language, shares your prayers, and once stood beside you at the same table. Sir Henry Percy, Hotspur, wasn't a bandit. He was a great lord, a celebrated captain, and for a time, a pillar of my father's reign. He had taught me how to read a battlefield, how to judge distance, how to keep a horse steady under pressure, how to hold a line when fear tries to loosen it. And then he turned. The reasons weren't simple, but they were familiar. Money, pride, frustration, and the feeling that loyalty was being taken for granted. My father's reign was young and unstable. The treasury was strained. Wales burned. Scotland stirred. France watched. And payments that should have flowed to men like Hotspur slowed, stalled, or came with conditions. To my father, caution felt necessary. To Hotspur, it felt like betrayal. So he raised men. He raised banners. He raised the kind of rebellion that doesn't creep in the dark, it marches in the open and dares you to answer. My father answered, and so did I. I was 16. That number matters because it tells you what kind of person I was being forced to become. At 16, most boys are still learning who they are. I was learning what it meant to stand at the center of a kingdom that had already been shaken by a usurpation, and to defend that kingdom against its own nobles. On the morning of the battle, the field didn't look like the kind of place legends are born. It looked ordinary. Grass, uneven ground, hedgerows, but the atmosphere was wrong. Too quiet, too tense. You could hear the small things, leather straps creaking, horses snorting, the faint clink of metal as men shifted their weight. In the camp, there was no theatrical bravado. Men checked their gear, adjusted their helmets, tightened belts. Some murmured prayers. Some said nothing at all. My father, Henry IV, stood near me. No crown, no ceremony, just a king with a contested throne and a rebellion directly in front of him. We exchanged a look that said everything without words. Today cannot end in weakness. Not for us, not for Lancaster, not for England. Across the field, Hotspur's line held firm. Their banners snapped in the wind. Their archers stood ready. And somewhere behind those ranks were men who might have served my family yesterday and could serve it again tomorrow if we proved we were the stronger side. That's the cruel truth of politics in this age. Loyalty often follows momentum. When the lines began to move, it wasn't fast. Armor slows everything. It turns a man into weight and heat and breath. Every step is deliberate. Every pace forward is a decision. Arrows began to fly. Dark streaks against clouded sky. Shields lifted. Men ducked behind wood and steel. Not everyone panicked, but everyone felt it. The moment when words end and consequences begin. Then the two sides met. There is no elegant way to describe what happens when armored lines collide at close range. It isn't like the tournament lists where two riders charge cleanly and the crowd can see who wins. This was pressure. Bodies packed tight, polearms pushing and hooking. Men braced shoulder to shoulder, trying to keep their footing while the ground shifted under them. In that kind of struggle, glory is not loud. It's stubborn. It's staying upright. It's refusing to give an inch when your legs are shaking. I moved into the thick of it, partly because that is where a commander can see the truth, and partly because I understood what it meant for the heir to hide behind others. If I wanted men to hold, I had to be visible holding with them. And then it happened. A single arrow struck me in the face, just below my right eye. People imagine something dramatic, an instant collapse, a theatrical moment. It wasn't like that. It was shock first, the sudden, violent certainty that something has entered your body and does not belong there. My head jolted with the force. My knees flexed instinctively to absorb it. The world tightened to a narrow tunnel of sound and breath. I could feel the shaft. I could feel the weight of it, the wrongness of it. Later, I would learn how deep it had gone, about 6 inches, lodged where it should have ended my life. In that heartbeat, I didn't know measurements. I only knew that if I went down, the line around me would feel it. So I stayed upright. Not because I was fearless, because fear can do strange things. Sometimes it makes you run. Sometimes it makes you freeze. And sometimes, if you understand what's at stake, it makes you hold on with a kind of desperate discipline that looks like courage from the outside. The men around me reacted immediately. Someone reached for me. Someone tried to pull me back. But I raised a hand, firm, unmistakable. Not now, not in front of them. I don't say this to make myself sound heroic. I say it because it was a lesson in real time. A leader's body is part of the battlefield. If the prince looks broken, the army starts to break with him. So I kept moving, slowly, carefully, still directing, still bracing,
still refusing to let the moment own me. Hours later, after the rebellion collapsed, after Hotspur fell and his challenge ended, my body finally demanded its due. They brought me to a surgeon's tent. Lanterns flickered against damp canvas. Bowls of wine and water were laid out. Iron tools gleamed softly in the low light. The surgeon was John Bradmore, skilled, calm, and faced with a problem that could not be solved by simple pulling. The arrowhead was barbed. If he yanked it back the way a man might yank a thorn, it would tear and destroy. So he did something astonishing for the time. He used a specially designed instrument, something like a threaded extractor, that could grip the arrowhead from within. He worked slowly, turning with controlled pressure, inch by inch, while assistants held me steady. No frantic motions, no drama, just careful force and patience. It was one of the strangest moments of my life. Not the pain, though there was pain, but the clarity. Lying there, held still by straps and hands, listening to the quiet instructions of a man trying to keep me alive, I understood something that no battlefield teaches you. A king is mortal, a prince is fragile, and all the future plans of a dynasty can depend on a single tool in a surgeon's hands. When the arrowhead finally came free, it was placed into a bowl as if it were a relic, silent proof that I had been closer to death than anyone wanted to admit. Bradmore irrigated the wound with wine, cleaned it with meticulous care, and dressed it in a way meant to prevent infection. In an age without modern medicine, survival often depended less on bravery and more on luck and cleanliness. Somehow, I had enough of both. As the days passed and I could sit up again, the scar began to form. It wasn't just a mark on my face, it became a permanent reminder. I had been tested and I had endured. But Shrewsbury left behind lessons deeper than a scar. The first was about loyalty. Hotspur's rebellion showed me that a kingdom cannot be held together by charisma alone. Loyalty must be cultivated, rewarded, and watched. It is not a coin you spend once and forget. It is a bond that can fray under pressure. If a great lord feels neglected or humiliated, he may decide the risk of rebellion is worth it. The second lesson was about reliance. My father, for all his faults, understood something essential. In unstable times, family matters. Not because family is always virtuous, but because family has shared fate. A brother's success is tied to yours. A cousin's downfall stains your name as well. In a realm of shifting alliances, blood can be the closest thing to a fixed point. After Shrewsbury, I looked more closely at my brothers, my Beaufort kin, and the Lancastrian household. I began to understand that if I wanted stability, I needed a core of men whose fortunes were tied to mine so tightly that betrayal would mean self-destruction. And the third lesson was about the kind of king I would need to be. A king must be seen. A king must endure. A king must choose discipline even when emotion calls for something else. I returned to training as soon as I could, carefully at first, then with more strength. I relearned balance and movement with armor on my shoulders. I learned to fight with the knowledge that a single mistake can change history. Sometimes, in quiet moments, I would touch the bandage, then later the scar, and feel a strange calm. Not happiness, not pride, more like acceptance. Because Shrewsbury had done something to me. It stripped away any remaining illusion that power is safe, and it replaced that illusion with a sharper truth, that if I ever became king, I would not have the luxury of being naive about people, or about money, or about what it.
By the time the fighting in Wales began to lean in our favor, another battlefield opened in front of me. One made of oak tables, sealed parchments, and men who could ruin a kingdom with a single sentence. My father, Henry IV, was still king, but his body was failing him. Some days he could sit upright and speak with the force that had won him the crown. Other days he was seized by illness, weakness, sudden collapses, long stretches where he could barely rule at all. And when a king disappears into sickness, power doesn't vanish. It simply gathers somewhere else. It gathered around me. In the winter of 1406, I attended my first meetings of the King's Council. I was still young, but not young enough to be spared the truth. The realm was strained, Wales was costly, Scotland was uneasy, France was always watching, and the treasury, God help us, was never as full as the threats demanded. If you've never sat in a room where men argue about money while soldiers starve at the frontier, let me tell you, it changes you. It takes the romance out of war. It turns glory into numbers in a ledger, rents collected, debts owed, payments delayed, supplies missing. I had learned in Wales that an army runs on coin as surely as it runs on courage. Now I was learning that a kingdom does too. Around this time, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Arundel, became a central figure in government again. He was intelligent, firm, and deeply concerned with restoring order, especially financial order. And for all the tension he would later represent, I respected what he understood. A crown that cannot pay its bills becomes a crown that cannot command loyalty. So we began to do what my father had struggled to do, tighten the kingdom's belt. That meant looking at the old habits that drained the treasury. It meant questioning annuities, those yearly payments given to powerful men as rewards. My father believed these payments were the glue holding his fragile reign together. He feared that if he reduced them, he would turn loyal supporters into enemies. I understood his fear. I had seen what great lords can do disappointed. But I also understood the other side. You cannot buy stability forever on credit. A kingdom built on constant payouts is a kingdom waiting for the day the coin runs out, and that day was always closer than anyone wanted to admit. While we worked on money, we also worked on authority. In those years, the government increasingly leaned on the wider royal family, not only because we trusted them, but because their presence carried meaning. A prince or a duke arriving in a troubled region could do what a dozen proclamations could not. It reminded people that the crown was watching. So, my brother Thomas, still barely more than a boy, was sent to Ireland, surrounded by advisors. His youth didn't matter as much as the symbol. He was the king's blood on Irish soil, and that alone could steady wavering loyalties. My brother John was sent north, to the borderlands, to help contain unrest and keep Scotland quiet. John proved to be more than a soldier. He had a mind for administration, something rare and valuable in an age when many noblemen preferred tournaments to accounting. And I began to see my family not only as kin, but as instruments of governance. That sounds cold, I know, but it's the truth of kingship. You learn to measure people by what they can carry, not only in their hands, but in their judgment. As my father's health worsened, my own role became heavier. I was no longer only the Prince of Wales, the commander in the West. I became something else, the king's shadow on the council floor, the voice people listened to when they weren't sure whether the king could rise from bed that day. By around 1409, the balance of power tilted even more. Arundel was pushed aside for a time, and a group of my supporters rose into influence. In effect, we were running the government while my father faded in and out of strength. Our focus remained the same: reform the finances, restore confidence, reduce waste, keep the realm steady. But no government can exist on accounting alone. A king must also think outward, to threats and opportunities beyond his borders. And beyond our borders, France was tearing itself apart. The French king, Charles VI, suffered from bouts of mental collapse. When he was well, he could rule. When he was not, the realm became a prize fought over by rival factions. Burgundy and Orleans, powerful houses, dangerous ambitions, and a civil war growing sharper with every year. To England, French division was always an opportunity. I began to lean towards Burgundy, towards John the Fearless. It wasn't because I trusted him, it was because civil war in France served English interests, and Burgundy's rivalry with the crown's closest supporters could be used like a wedge. And I also understood something very medieval, very practical. Alliances were often built through marriage. If Burgundy could be brought closer, if a marriage could be arranged, then England might not only gain a diplomatic partner, but a quieter France, at least long enough for us to act. In my mind, this was sensible. It was strategic. It was the kind of move a king in waiting should make. My father disagreed. He had known the French court in earlier years. He believed Burgundy was the wrong horse to back. He feared we were building a plan on shifting sand. And more than that, he feared what my reforms at home were doing to the political nation. Then, in 1411, the old king came back. Not fully, not permanently, but enough to remind everyone that Henry IV was still alive, still king, and still unwilling to be treated as a man already buried. In Parliament, he appeared and spoke calmly of novelties. his word for the changes my supporters had pushed into government. He meant our cuts, he meant our foreign policy, he meant the whispers that he should abdicate in my favor. And then he did something that cut deeper than an insult. He dismissed my people, politely, with thanks, and replaced them. Arundel returned as chancellor, my brother Thomas was elevated into authority, and I, the prince who had been carrying the weight of government, found myself suddenly outside the door. It's difficult to describe what that felt like without sounding either bitter or childish, so I'll say it simply. I was furious. Not because I believed I deserved power like a toy, but because I believed the realm was fragile, and I believed I was helping hold it together. To be removed and to watch policies reversed felt like watching someone loosen a knot while the rope was still bearing weight. My father changed course on France as well. In 1412, he concluded the Treaty of Bourges, aligning more directly with the French crown side against Burgundy. To reinforce it, he sent my brother Thomas to Gascony. It was a message as clear as any spoken word. The king was not only taking control back, he was choosing a different future than the one I had been shaping. For a time, I had no answer to that. My pride wanted confrontation, my instinct wanted resistance, but reality held me by the throat. No one knew how long my father would live. He had recovered before, he might recover again. He could rule another decade, another 2, and if I stayed locked out of government that long, my influence would decay, my allies would drift, and the realm I would one day inherit would become unfamiliar to me. So I chose the harder path. In July of 1412, I went to my father's chamber. I brought him a note, and in a gesture that has been repeated in stories ever since, I placed a dagger before him, offering my life rather than living in his displeasure. It was dramatic, yes, but it was also sincere, because beneath the politics, he was still my father. He pushed the dagger away, he embraced me, he wept. For a moment, the tension between us broke like ice under sunlight. But kingship is not sentimental. It is relentless. Within weeks, his illness returned, and this time it did not loosen its grip. By early 1413, he deteriorated again. He was moved to Lambeth Palace across the Thames, and then to Westminster. And there, in the Jerusalem chamber, he died on March 20th, 1413. I had reconciled with him before the end. I had his blessing. And yet, the moment he was gone, the air itself seemed heavier, as if the crown, unseen, had already settled onto my shoulders. That night, the story goes, I walked away from family and ceremony and sought quiet counsel from a hermit, speaking of morality and of my fear that the nobles might fracture the realm again. Whether every detail is true, the feeling is true. I was afraid. Not of battle, not of hardship. I was afraid of what happens after a contested reign ends, when every ambitious man asks himself if the next king is strong enough to resist him. And then came my coronation. April 9th, 1413, Westminster Abbey, and a blizzard, an unnatural spring storm that shocked the city. Snow whipped across the abbey steps. People whispered about omens. Some said it meant cleansing, washing away the instability of the past. Others wondered if it warned of worse to come. I didn't argue with the sky. I only made a promise in my own mind. I would rule with purpose. I would bind wounds where I could. I would be seen as more than my father's son, more than the heir of a usurper. I would be, in the eyes of the realm, a king who brings order, who turns fear into discipline and uncertainty into direction. Because the truth was now unavoidable. The king-in-waiting was. The night my father died, Westminster didn't feel like the heart of an empire. It felt like a sealed chamber at the edge of a cliff. In the Jerusalem chamber, where candlelight clung to carved oak and the air carried incense and damp stone, Henry IV lay beneath heavy linens, no longer the warrior who had crossed the sea in exile and returned to seize a crown, but a man worn down by years of strain and sickness. Clergy murmured prayers. Attendants moved softly, as if sound itself might disturb the fragile balance between breath and silence. I stood there and watched the life leave him on March 20th, 1413, and I understood, with a clarity that almost hurt, that the throne does not pass like a gift, it drops like a weight. One moment your father is king, the next the whole realm is looking for your hand to steady it. There's a story that on that same night, I slipped away from the court and went to speak with a hermit near St. Benet's, talking until dawn about morality, about fear, about the kind of conflict that can erupt when powerful men sense weakness. Whether every detail happened exactly that way matters less than the truth behind it. I did not sleep. I could not. Because I knew what England was whispering. My father had taken the crown. Some called him a savior. Some called him a usurper. And when a dynasty is born under suspicion, every successor inherits not only a kingdom, but a question mark. My reign had to answer that question, quickly, visibly, and with purpose. On April 9th, 1413, I was crowned at Westminster Abbey, and as if heaven itself wanted to make the moment unforgettable, a blizzard struck the city, snow whipping across the Abbey steps, banners heavy and stiff in the wind, Londoners huddled in wool cloaks as they stared up at the Gothic towers disappearing into white. People love omens. In the crowd, some took it as a warning, others believed it meant cleansing, snow washing away the instability of the past. I didn't argue with the sky. I took it as a reminder. The new king would not be spared hardship, not by weather, not by politics, not by history. So when the ceremonies ended, I did not linger in triumph. I went to work. The first thing I needed was unity, not the kind sung in churches, but the kind that prevents knives in the dark. My father's reign had been marked by plots and rebellions. Families had been punished, titles stripped, heirs held under guard. Some of those actions were necessary at the time, but if I began my reign by continuing every grudge, I would spend my youth fighting England rather than leading it. So I made decisions meant to close old wounds. I released Edmund Mortimer, once seen as a rival claimant, and restored his estates. I did more than free him. I drew him close. I made it clear that I would rather turn potential threats into pillars than rule through fear alone. I offered honors to men who had been kept at a distance. I restored titles, returned lands, and called former enemies back into the realm's shared story. I even reached into the most haunted corner of recent memory, Richard II. Richard's fall had opened the path for my father, and his death had left a shadow over the Lancastrian claim. So I ordered Richard's body moved from its quiet resting place at King's Langley and reburied at Westminster Abbey, near his first wife, Anne of Bohemia, as he had wished. It was a gesture of respect, yes, but also a message to England. The new king does not fear the dead king's memory. The new king can afford to be magnanimous. These weren't acts of softness, they were acts of strategy. A realm that believes the king is just can be asked to sacrifice. A realm that believes the king is vengeful will only wait for the moment to resist. But unity wasn't my only problem. There was religion, always religion. England had been wrestling for decades with reform movements and dissent. Followers of John Wycliffe, often called Lollards, questioned practices, challenged authority, and spread ideas that threatened the unity of the church as the medieval world understood it. Under my father, harsh measures had been used to suppress them. By the time I took the throne, the tension was still there, like embers under ash. And then there was Sir John Oldcastle. Oldcastle wasn't just a name in a file. He had been a companion in earlier years, a trusted soldier, a man I once respected. He was also committed to Lollard beliefs. When the church moved against him, I tried to do what a king rarely can. I tried to save a friend without weakening the law. I gave him time, 40 days, to reconsider, to step back from open defiance, to choose a path that wouldn't force my hand. But Oldcastle did not choose that path. He escaped custody, and worse, he became entangled in a conspiracy aimed at the crown itself. That moment taught me a bitter lesson. Mercy is not always answered with gratitude. Sometimes it is answered with daring. And when a king is challenged publicly, he cannot respond like a private man. I could not let my friendship become a crack in the wall of authority. The realm needed to see that the crown would not be bent by personal ties. Oldcastle fled and remained at large for years, but from that point forward, my approach to dissent hardened, not because I enjoyed severity, but because I understood how quickly ideology and ambition can fuse into something dangerous.
Even as I dealt with unrest at home, Europe was shaking with a crisis that reached far beyond England's shores. The church itself was divided by the Great Schism, multiple popes, competing claims, rival courts of faith. To medieval people, this was more than politics, it was existential. If the church was divided, where did that leave salvation? Where did that leave the legitimacy of kings who ruled by God's will? A council was called at Constance in 1414 to end the schism. I sent envoys. I supported the effort, not only because I wanted a united church, but because I understood what such a council could offer me: a stage. To be seen as a pious king, aligned with the restoration of unity, was a powerful form of legitimacy, especially for a dynasty still accused, in some minds, of taking the crown by force. And at Constance I could also build relationships with rulers that mattered. None mattered more than Sigismund, King of the Romans, later Holy Roman Emperor, one of the most influential men in Europe. In the medieval world, alliances weren't always signed first with ink. They were signed with shared purpose, shared ceremony, shared recognition. If I could stand with Sigismund in the work of healing the church, I could also invite him indirectly to see my ambitions against France as something more than a personal war. I could frame it as part of a broader order, one God might approve. Constance did, in time, end the schism. A new pope, Martin V, was elected. The council also condemned heretical teachings across Europe, including those linked to Wycliffe. For me, that meant two things. Religious unity was strengthened, and I gained stronger moral ground to act against dissent at home. All of this, reconciliation at home, discipline in religion, alliance in Europe, was not separate from my larger purpose. It was the foundation for it. Because from the first days of my reign, I was already looking across the channel. France was divided, its king, Charles VI, often unable to rule, its nobility split into factions, and England, my England, had not forgotten its claims or its losses. Some men spoke of those claims as ancient history. I spoke of them as unfinished business. But I knew I could not rush into France like a reckless young knight rushes into a tournament. An invasion demanded preparation, money, ships, weapons, supply lines, and a nation that believed the war was worth paying for. So I began to shape England into a war machine, quietly, methodically. Not with wild speeches, but with ledgers and shipwrights, with bowyers and fletchers, with fortifications repaired along coasts and borders, with diplomacy that made enemies hesitate and allies keep their distance from France, with a careful tightening of discipline, so that when we crossed the sea, we would look not like raiders, but like an army that expected to rule what it took. And on some nights, alone with a single candle and the crown nearby, I would feel the strange stillness that comes when you realize your life has stopped being personal. I was no longer simply Henry of Monmouth. I was Henry V. And destiny, whether you believe in God's hand or history's momentum or the simple consequences of human choice, was opening like a road in front of me. Not an easy road, not a clean one, but a road that led, inevitably, towards France.
The war with France didn't begin with a trumpet blast. It began with paper. In the first years of my reign, I sat in rooms that smelled of wax, ink, and smoke from candle wicks, watching diplomats bow, watching clerks copy the same phrases in careful Latin and French, watching men pretend that words alone could settle a question that had been bleeding for generations. Because that was the question hanging over everything. What was England's right in France? To the French, my claim was arrogance dressed as tradition. To many in England, it was inheritance, unfinished and dishonored. And to me, it was something more personal, a way to prove that the House of Lancaster was not a temporary accident of politics, but a dynasty with destiny behind it. So in the summer of 1414, I did what medieval kings were expected to do before they marched. I negotiated. Not because I believed France would truly give me what I wanted, but because the ritual mattered. A king who goes to war without first seeking peace risks looking like a predator. A king who can say, "I offer terms," looks like a judge carrying out a sentence. My envoys carried demands that were never meant to be small. Lands once held by my forebears, recognition of old rights, and the hand of Catherine of France, Charles VI's daughter, along with a dowry worthy of her station. The numbers that floated through those rooms sounded enormous, even to hardened nobles. We spoke of millions of crowns, the way men speak of mountains, too large to grasp, but impossible to ignore. The French answered with something far less, and with conditions they knew I couldn't accept. It was negotiation as theater. Everyone played their role, everyone kept their face calm, and everyone knew that the real decision was being made elsewhere, behind the words. While France stalled, argued, and underestimated us, I prepared. And preparation in this age is not romantic. It is a nation being reshaped quietly into a weapon. I ordered ships built and gathered, not just a handful, but a fleet strong enough to move an army across the channel and keep that army supplied. I demanded that the ports be ready, Southampton, Portsmouth, the coastal towns that would become gateways to war. I oversaw the production of weapons on a scale England had rarely attempted: longbows, armor, lances, and above all, arrows. Tens of thousands upon tens of thousands, each one fletched, bundled, and stored. I pushed for cannons too, still crude compared to what would come later, but powerful enough to speak to stone walls in a language they understood. I secured the realm behind me, because a king who leaves England while the borders are loose invites disaster. Castles and coastal defenses were repaired, the Welsh marches were watched, the Scottish border was kept quiet, helped in part by one of my most practical decisions, keeping James of Scotland in England as a valuable guarantee. It was not kindness, it was stability. And then I reached outward, beyond England's shores, to make sure France would face me with fewer friends. I negotiated truces and trade agreements, because sometimes a treaty is worth more than a battle. I dealt with merchants and seafarers, men who didn't care about chivalry but cared deeply about profit. I wanted fewer raids against English shipping. I wanted calmer seas. I wanted to move men and supplies without being bled along the way. I also worked to keep Brittany from becoming a dagger at my side, and I kept an eye on Flanders, where ships and money could be found if the right terms were offered. And in the background of all of it, I watched Burgundy. France was split by civil war, Armagnac against Burgundian, and that fracture was a gift, if handled carefully. I didn't need Burgundy to love England. I only needed Burgundy to hesitate, to stay neutral long enough for me to land and strike. So I extended hands, offered incentives, listened through intermediaries. I laid the groundwork for a moment when Burgundy might decide that letting an English king weaken the French crown was for them the least dangerous outcome. Meanwhile, I also kept one eye on the church, because legitimacy in this world is not only built with swords, it is built with approval, especially spiritual approval. The Council of Constance was working to end the Great Schism. I supported those efforts through envoys and diplomacy, knowing that a king who appears pious and aligned with unity stands taller in the eyes of Europe. And I was not ashamed to admit it. I wanted Europe to see my cause not as reckless aggression, but lawful inheritance backed by order. All of this cost money, an uncomfortable amount of money. We used traditional revenues, rents, fees, customs duties. We pushed trade subsidies hard. We borrowed. We asked for loans that everyone understood were patriotic contributions. And even when that wasn't enough, we made decisions that shocked some of the realm. We used treasure as collateral. Even the crown itself, symbol of majesty, could be treated briefly as an object to secure funds. To some, it looked like desperation. To me, it was commitment, because once you decide to cross the sea and stake your reign on a campaign, there is no room for half measures. A timid invasion fails, and failure would have been worse than debt. Failure would have reopened every question about Lancaster legitimacy. Failure would have invited rebels at home and laughter abroad. By the summer of 1415, the camp at Southampton swelled with men and wagons. Banners snapped above rows of tents. Ships crowded the harbor. The kingdom felt like it was leaning forward. And then, just as we were ready to sail, the ground shifted beneath my feet. An enemy had been hiding inside the walls. An enemy not from France, but from England. A plot emerged at Southampton. The names involved were high and dangerous: Richard, Earl of Cambridge, Lord Scrope, and Sir Thomas Grey. Their aim, at least in essence, was to remove me and place Edmund Mortimer on the throne, the same Mortimer whose claim had troubled my father's reign. What makes this moment even sharper is that Mortimer himself revealed the conspiracy to me. Whether he did it out of loyalty or self-preservation or simple recognition that the plot was doomed, only God knows. But the fact remains, the man they intended to crown chose instead to warn the king they planned to replace.
When the report reached me, I did not allow panic to spread. I did not allow rumor to grow legs. I moved swiftly, because a king cannot sail to war with a knife still pressed against his back. The conspirators were arrested, trials were held, judgments were passed, and I did what kings sometimes are forced to do. I turned grief into steel, because betrayal from a stranger can be expected. Betrayal from men who have sat at your table is something else. It poisons trust. It threatens the entire structure of command, especially on the edge of a campaign where unity is everything. Once justice was done, I ordered the confiscation and sale of certain properties. Some called it harsh, some called it unlawful. But war was coming, and war consumes resources like fire consumes dry wood. I was not going to allow traitors to leave behind the states that could fund future unrest, or to deny the crown the means it needed to finish what it had begun. Then I did something that reveals the mind of a king more than any speech. I wrote my will. Not because I expected to die, but because I refused to leave chaos behind if I did. I appointed my brother John, Duke of Bedford, to oversee England while I was away. I ensured the machinery of government would keep moving, because a king who builds a great campaign and forgets the homeland is a king building his own ruin. And finally, after months of preparation, years of ambition, and one last betrayal crushed beneath my feet, I stepped onto my flagship. On August 11th, 1415, I boarded the Trinity Royal. The wind off the channel was sharp, sails strained, rigging creaked. The harbor behind me began to fade into mist, as if England itself was dissolving into a memory. I stood at the rail and looked towards France, not as a distant enemy, but as a destiny that had been gathering for decades, perhaps for generations. Some men would later call what I did courage, some would call it arrogance, some would call it inevitable. In that moment, it felt like none of those things. It felt like responsibility. Because once the fleet began to move, once the sea opened in front of us, there was no turning back, not without paying a price far greater than money. And as England disappeared behind the haze, I carried one certainty with me across the water. If I was to be remembered as a true king, it would not be for the crown I inherited, it would be for what I dared to claim and what I could make the world accept.
When we finally crossed the Channel in the summer of 1415, France didn't greet us with a heroic clash. It greeted us with silence, and that silence was dangerous. We anchored off the northern coast near Chef de Caen, and I refused to let excitement turn into carelessness. I ordered that no one leave the ships until we knew what waited on shore. In wars like this, the first mistake can become the last. So scouting boats went in first, oars cutting through gray water, mist clinging to the dunes. The men stepped onto French sand cautiously, boots sinking, shields balanced, eyes searching for traps. Only when the scouts returned with the message that the landing was safe did I give the signal. Then the invasion began in earnest. Longboats scraped onto the shallows, men waded through marshy water with gear held high. Horses snorted as their hooves found slick ground. Carts and barrels were unloaded and stacked. Banners were planted, heavy with sea mist. It was orderly, methodical, because discipline is the only thing that keeps a landing from becoming chaos. And ahead of us, beyond mudflats and salt marsh, rose Harfleur. I chose Harfleur for one reason above all, the Seine. Harfleur sat near the mouth of the river like a hand on a throat. If I could seize it, I would have a foothold in Normandy and a doorway toward Paris itself. It was a practical target, not a romantic one, but practical victories are the ones that build kingdoms. From a low rise, I studied the town's walls through haze. Harfleur had strong defenses, stone towers, thick walls, and the protection of marshy ground. It wasn't a fortress built to fall quickly, but I didn't come to France expecting quick gifts. I came expecting work. We encircled the town with care, placing forces on multiple sides. My brother Thomas moved troops to higher ground to complete the ring. And then, as custom demanded, I offered the defenders the chance to surrender. In the medieval world, a king was expected to offer peace before bloodshed, partly for honor, partly for conscience, partly so history could record that the enemy chose their fate. Harfleur refused, so we began the siege. The first days were the familiar rhythm of siege warfare, digging, building, hauling timber, raising earthworks, setting up artillery.
Bombards and smaller guns were emplaced, crews working in steady cycles, load, brace, fire, while smoke drifted low and damp across the field. Each shot was heavy labor, each impact was another message to the walls: time is against you. Inside Harfleur, the townspeople moved through narrow streets with growing fear. Supplies were counted, water was carried. People gathered in churches to pray, candles trembling in the dim. Defenders rotated on the battlements, ducking behind stone as dust fell from fresh cracks. And then a different enemy arrived, one neither side could negotiate with: illness. The siege dragged into late August and early September, and sickness began to spread through both camps. What we would now recognize as dysentery and other camp diseases took hold, fed by damp conditions, crowded lines, and the constant strain of siege life. Men who could stand in armor one day could barely rise the next. This is something historians sometimes forget when they list battles and dates. Medieval armies were as vulnerable to disease as they were to steel. In a long campaign, illness could erase an advantage faster than any enemy charge. In my camp, we set up rough medical shelters: linens, bowls, wine for washing, iron tools laid out with grim efficiency. I visited the sick briefly, not to dramatize compassion, but because a king must see what his orders cost. You cannot command suffering at a distance and remain human. In Harfleur, hunger began to tighten. Supplies shrank. Officials measured the last grain with hands that shook, not from cowardice, but from reality. The town tried to send messages out, hoping for relief. For a time, they still believed someone would come. But relief did not come. France was divided, slow to act, and uncertain who should lead. Their king was often absent in mind. Their nobles were tangled in rivalry, and while Harfleur waited, the ring around them tightened. By the third week of September, it was clear: the town was on its own. When the signal of surrender finally appeared, white cloth fluttering from the battlements, it didn't feel like triumph. It felt like a door opening after a long, grinding pressure. The gates swung inward, heavy and slow, rainwater running down stone and iron. My men held discipline. No wild rush, no disorder. We entered in formation because I had one goal beyond taking the town. I wanted the people of France to see that I came not as a raider, but as a ruler who expected obedience and offered order. I went straight to the Church of St. Michael to pray, not for show, though in truth everything a king does becomes show, but because I needed to anchor myself. Siege victory is never clean. It is always paid for, often by people who had little choice in the matter. Then I laid down rules. Churches were not to be violated, clergy were not to be harmed, women were not to be abused, plundering without permission was forbidden. In an age where armies often treated conquered towns as prizes to be stripped, these rules were not softness, they were strategy. An army without discipline becomes its own enemy, and a king who cannot restrain his men cannot rule what he takes. I offered the people of Harfleur terms. Those who swore allegiance could remain and rebuild. Those who refused, especially the wealthy, were held for ransom, as was customary. The poor, the sick, women and children were allowed to leave with what they could carry, escorted toward French lines. It was a harsh settlement, but it was measured, and it served my larger aim, to present myself as a lawful king, not a destructive force. Meanwhile, the reality of the siege was on my mind. Many of my own men were sick, some were wounded. My brother Thomas fell ill as well and had to be sent back to England. The army that had landed in France in strength was already thinning, and that is where the most important decision of the campaign came. On October 5th, I held council. Many advised returning home. Harfleur was a significant victory. It could be celebrated, it could be defended. We could sail back before the weather worsened and before sickness did more damage. But I did not come to France merely to take one port and then retreat. I needed a victory that rang across Europe. I needed to show not only courage, but momentum. So I chose to march to Calais. It was a gamble, and I knew it. I left a garrison at Harfleur, Thomas Beaufort, Earl of Dorset, with a small force of men-at-arms and archers to hold the town. The fleet was ordered to patrol the coast and the Seine estuary to keep supply lines open. Harfleur had to become a foothold, not a trophy. Then, on October 8th, we broke camp. I remembered the feel of that morning: damp air, mud already thick, tents folding, carts creaking under loads. Men pulled their boots free with that wet sucking sound the ground makes when it doesn't want to let you go. Faces were thin and tired, but the line held. Discipline held. That was everything. We marched through Normandy under gray skies and cold drizzle. Harfleur fell behind us like a shadow, its walls now flying English banners. Ahead lay fields and hedgerows, villages that watched us cautiously through doorways, and roads that could lead either to safety or to the closing jaws of a trap. I kept strict control over foraging and movement. I knew what hunger can do to an army, but I also knew what disorder can do to an army. If my men began to behave like bandits, every villager would become an enemy, every door would close, every path would carry whispers to French scouts. So we moved like a single body, slow, heavy, deliberate. And we were not alone. French riders began to shadow us in the distance, small silhouettes on ridgelines, watchers through mist. Sometimes we saw them, sometimes we only felt them. But the message was clear: France was waking up. At night, we made camp, small fires struggling against damp wind. Men warmed hands, checked straps, covered bowstrings. I walked among them. I did not speak in grand speeches. I didn't need to. A king's presence is its own kind of speech, especially when the men are exhausted. They needed to see that I shared the hardship, that I didn't command comfort while they slept in mud. Then the Somme became the next barrier. We had planned to cross at places known from earlier campaigns, like Blanc-Tech, but the French remembered history too. They destroyed crossings, broke bridges, and forced us deeper into their territory. Every mile away from Calais was another mile into uncertainty. And still we marched, until at last chance arrived in the form of a local who pointed to an unguarded ford. Small things.
The march from Harfleur to Calais was supposed to be difficult. I didn't expect it to become a trap. After Harfleur fell, my army was smaller, tired, and weakened by illness. We still had discipline, but discipline doesn't fill an empty stomach. Each day on the road through Normandy felt heavier than the last. Mud pulling at boots, drizzle soaking wool, and the constant awareness that we were being watched. At first, the countryside seemed quiet. Norman fields, hedgerows, small villages with timber houses and wary faces in doorways. But the silence wasn't peace, it was distance. It was people holding their breath, waiting to see who would win and who would punish. I kept the rules strict. Foraging was controlled. No wandering bands, no uncontrolled plunder. Not because I believed war could be gentle, but because I understood what this order would do to us. If my men behaved like raiders, every village would become an enemy. Food would vanish behind locked doors. Paths would become ambushes, and every peasant could become a messenger to the French. So we moved like one body, heavy and deliberate. And still, hunger crept in. You could see it in small things. The way men broke bread more carefully. The way they stared too long at a cooking pot. The way a soldier's hand lingered on an empty ration pouch, as if willing it to produce something. When an army is hungry, it becomes quieter. Not calmer, but more inward. Every man begins to count his own strength. I made myself visible. I rode along the line, not to impress, but to steady. In a long march, morale is as fragile as a bowstring in rain. Men don't need speeches every hour. They need to know the king is watching the same gray sky they are, stepping through the same mud, accepting the same hardship. Then the French began to show themselves. At first, just riders on distant ridges, small silhouettes against the dull horizon. Then scouts slipping away into hedgerows. Then the sense of shadowing, as if every road we chose had already been considered by someone else. I knew what they were doing. They were trying to deny us a clean crossing of the Somme. The Somme is not the widest river in France, but it can be made into a wall if the crossings are controlled. My plan had been simple. Reach an old ford, Blanc-Tech, then continue toward Calais. It had worked for Edward III in an earlier age. I intended to follow that logic. But the French remembered history too. When we reached the river, we found crossings broken, bridges dismantled, and defensive positions prepared. Timbers lay shattered, stone piers stood like broken teeth. Water ran gray and fast beneath low mist, and every attempt to find the quick passage was met with the same answer: no. That moment is where many commanders lose their nerve. If you panic, you scatter. If you scatter, you die. So I did what Wales had taught me to do. I stayed disciplined, and I stayed moving. We marched downstream, searching for another way across, while the river ran beside us like a cold reminder that the enemy had the initiative. The days that followed were a slow tightening. The ground became wetter. Marshes widened. Fog thickened. Some lanes were so narrow between hedgerow and ditch that the column stretched into a thin ribbon, difficult to feed, difficult to protect. The wagons sunk into ruts. Wheels slipped. Men had to heave barrels back into place with straining shoulders and clenched teeth. In places, villagers watched from doorways with expressions that were not hostile, but not welcoming either. Faces that learned the safest posture is silence. And all the while, the French were not rushing to fight us. They were hurting us. They destroyed more crossings ahead of us. They blocked the obvious routes. They forced us farther from Calais, deeper into the interior, toward a place of their choosing. That is how the trap works, not by closing a door, but by guiding you through the only doors left open. At night, we camped in damp fields. Small fires struggled against wind. Men tried to keep bowstrings dry, wrapping them, warming hands, checking arrows, doing the quiet work that keeps an army alive. When an army is tired, every small task becomes slower. Every strap feels heavier. Every breath feels like you have to earn it. I made myself visible. I rode along the line, not to impress, but to steady. In a long march, morale is as fragile as a bowstring in rain. Men don't need speeches every hour. They need to know the king is watching the same gray sky they are, stepping through the same mud, accepting the same hardship. Then, chance arrived. Not in the form of a miracle, but in the form of a person. We encountered a local, some say a villager, some say a farmer, someone who knew the land in a way that no map could capture. Through careful questioning and cautious trust, we learned of a ford, unguarded, less known, a place where the river was shallow enough to take an army across. I didn't celebrate. I didn't let excitement ripple through the ranks too loudly. A discovery like that could be a gift or a trap of its own. We approached carefully, scouts first, then the main body. And on October 19th, 1415, we crossed. That crossing is not remembered the way Agincourt is remembered. But I tell you, standing in the water, watching men step from stone to stone, watching wagons lurch and then steady under the hands of sweating soldiers, it felt like a turning point. Boots slipped on submerged stones. Hooves hesitated, then found footing. Men moved slowly, holding packs high, controlling balance, controlling fear. It was not heroic in appearance. It was survival work. But survival is the foundation of every legend. When the last wagons reached the far bank and ranks reformed in damp fields, I felt something close to relief. Close to it. Because even as we crossed, I knew what would follow. The French would learn we had slipped their river trap. They would move faster. They would close in. They would look for the field where their numbers could finally speak. And they did. We marched on into Picardy and Artois, through open plowed fields and shadowed woodland lanes. The air turned colder. The light began to fade earlier. The countryside felt narrower, as if the land itself were funneling us forward. Soon we saw signs of the French host gathering in strength. Banners, cavalry, armored lines forming near Tramcourt. On the night of October 24th, we camped near Massencelles. Rain fell again. Not a gentle rain, but the kind that soaks through layers and turns roads into traps. It filled footprints with water, thickened the mud, made every movement harder. Fires hissed, tent lines sagged. Men tightened ropes and laid straw under their feet, trying to keep the ground from swallowing them in the morning. I walked through the camp that night. I didn't deliver a grand speech. I didn't need to. My men had marched too far and suffered too much to be moved by poetry alone. What they needed was presence, a steady figure, a king who did not look like he was searching for an escape.
I stopped beside small fires and spoke quietly to a few soldiers. Simple words, not dramatic ones. The kind of words you say when everyone knows the truth but needs to hear that someone still believes in the line holding. Then I went to pray. Not for glory, not even for victory. I prayed for steadiness, because in the morning, steadiness would matter more than any number of men. The French were near. Their campfires glowed in the distance like scattered stars. Their cavalry shifted and settled. Their leaders argued over position and honor. Their confidence was growing because they believed the trap was complete. And in a sense, it was. By dawn, we would stand on a narrow corridor between woods, a field softened by rain, ground that would punish weight and reward discipline. A place where our longbows, our stakes, and our cohesion could matter more than the size of their host. And in the darkness before that dawn, I put on my armor in silence. Buckles tightened, straps pulled snug. Metal settled onto my shoulders with familiar weight. My breath fogged in the cold air. And when I stepped outside into the pre-dawn mist, I could see my army forming into ranks. Shapes emerging from fog, banners heavy with moisture, archers checking arrows, men-at-arms planting feet into mud. Across the corridor, the French line began to appear too. Glints of metal, layers of standards, horses breathing steam into the air. This was the end of the march. This was the moment the trap became a battlefield. And as I looked across that narrow, rain-darkened ground, I understood the simple truth that every commander must eventually accept. Sometimes you do not choose whether you will fight. You only choose how you will stand when the fighting comes.
Dawn on October 25th, 1415, did not arrive with sunlight. It arrived with mist, drizzle, and a cold that made every breath visible. We stood in a narrow corridor between woods near Agincourt, English on one end, French on the other. The ground under our feet was plowed earth, recently seeded and soaked by rain in the night. Mud clung to boots and swallowed every step as if the land itself was trying to slow the living. Through the fog, the French line looked endless. Banners layered behind banners, men at arms crowded shoulder to shoulder, horses shifted and steamed in the chill. Their armor caught what little light the sky offered, turning their front into a distant wall of wet steel. My own line was smaller, tired, hungry, still weakened from sickness after Harfleur, but it was disciplined, and discipline is the only advantage an exhausted army can afford to trust. On the flanks, the archers waited behind angled wooden stakes, sharp points driven into the ground like teeth. They wore damp wool and leather, hands tight around longbows, arrows guarded as best we could from the wet. In the center, men at arms held polearms and shields, feet braced, bodies heavy with armor and fatigue. And at the center stood me. I could feel the scar beneath my right eye in the cold air, a reminder of Shrewsbury, of the day I learned what it meant to remain upright when every instinct screams to fall. I lifted my visor for a moment and looked across that corridor of mud and fog. This was not the kind of battlefield where you outmaneuver. There was nowhere to run wide, nowhere to split formations. The woods pressed in on both sides, turning the field into a funnel. Whoever entered first would be drawn forward, compressed, forced to fight in a space that punished numbers instead of rewarding them. And still, neither side moved. There were rituals, even here, rules about who should begin, honor, as the knights liked to call it. Both armies waited, tense and still, as if waiting could change the basic truth. We were here, and one side would break. I watched the French ranks shifting, not in unity, but in impatience. Too many nobles, too many commanders, too many men who expected to claim credit for what would happen. A horse stamped and slid slightly in mud, its rider corrected with a hard pull. Behind them, more men pressed forward without room to breathe. In that moment, I understood something Wales had taught me, and France was about to confirm. On the wrong ground, numbers become weight, and weight becomes weakness. I turned to one of my captains and listened to a brief report. It didn't matter how many men the French had. What mattered was the corridor, the mud, and whether my line could hold long enough for their own pressure to choke them. Then I decided the waiting was more dangerous than movement. I gave a short, unmistakable signal. Not a speech, not a flourish, just the command. Our line advanced only a few paces, slowly, deliberately. You could hear the mud resist and release. Boots pulled free with a wet suction sound. Polearms stayed level, shields remained steady. It wasn't a charge, it was a measured step into killing ground, taken with the kind of discipline that keeps fear from turning into panic. Across the field, the French reacted immediately. A ripple moved through their front, visors lifting, lances shifting, horses tossing their heads. Their leaders gestured and argued in quick motions, trying to force order onto impatience. And then my archers raised their bows. Longbows do not look like much when held at rest. They are wood and string, simple compared to gleaming plate armor. But in the hands of trained men, a longbow is a machine of pressure. It can be drawn and released with a rhythm that turns time itself against an enemy. The archers planted their feet, lifted in unison, and drew. You could see the tension in the bow limbs, the strain in forearms and shoulders under soaked sleeves. Fingers tightened around strings, breath steamed in the cold. For a heartbeat, everything seemed still. Then the first volley rose into the low clouds. A dark swarm of arrows vanished into fog and came down on the French line like judgment. The French lifted shields, ducked, braced, horses tensed and sidestepped. Armor rang with impacts, not always deadly, but always disruptive. Every hit was a reminder, you are not crossing this field untouched. The French answer came quickly. Their cavalry began to surge forward. But a cavalry charge on that ground was not the clean, thundering moment knights dream about. It was heavy, slow, slipping. Hooves sank deep in churned earth. Mud gripped fetlocks. Horses struggled to find purchase. Riders tried to keep lances level while controlling animals that could feel the stakes ahead. In places, momentum built, but the corridor was narrow, and the density of men behind them forced the front tighter and tighter. And then the stakes did what they were meant to do. The first horses hesitated, then bunched. Riders pulled hard on reins, lances tangled. The charge compressed into a knot instead of breaking through. In mud like this, even a strong horse becomes cautious. Even a brave rider becomes limited by physics, by weight, by footing, by the impossibility of moving freely when packed shoulder to shoulder. While the cavalry struggled, the archers fired again and again. The rhythm of knock, draw, release became relentless, fast, controlled, practiced. Each volley rose and fell. Each volley added pressure, not only on bodies but on order. It's hard to maintain formation when arrows are falling and the ground is pulling at your legs. Behind the stakes, my men-at-arms braced. Poleaxes and spears were set. Bodies leaned forward, knees bent, weight centered. The line held like a wall, quiet, stubborn, refusing to give the French what they needed most, room. Then the mass of French men-at-arms on foot began to push forward behind the failing cavalry. This is where the battle became truly brutal, not in gore, but in effort. When armored men fight in a cramped space, it's not about elegant swordplay. There's no room to swing. There's barely room to breathe. It becomes a press of bodies, a grinding push, weapons used to hook and shove, men slipping and regaining footing in mud that clings like glue. And the more the French pressed, the more their numbers betrayed them. They were too dense, too heavy, too trapped in their own momentum. The rear ranks pushed forward while the front ranks had nowhere to go. Armor that looked glorious on horseback became a burden when a man fell and could not rise quickly.
Mud swallowed knees, breath steamed inside helmets. The field turned their strength into exhaustion. I entered the press with my household around me. I did not hide behind banners. If the center broke, the battle was lost. And if the king looked distant, fear would spread faster than any enemy. So I stayed visible. There was a moment in that crush when my brother Humphrey went down, slipping, struck, trapped beneath bodies for an instant. I saw him fall, and for a fraction of time my mind went cold. Not because I panicked, but because I understood what it meant if he died there, if my family began to break apart in front of the army. I stepped toward him, shielding him, pushing back the immediate threat long enough for men to drag him away. It was not dramatic, it was not heroic in the way poets like. It was quick, heavy, and necessary. Two armored bodies colliding in mud, leverage and balance deciding everything. Then, as the hours wore on, the fight shifted again. We began to take prisoners, many of them noble, valuable in the medieval world because ransoms could be demanded. Under ordinary rules, those prisoners would be protected. They were wealth in human form. But the battlefield was still uncertain. I could see French reserves at the rear. I could feel how thin our control was, and I knew a harsh truth. We did not have enough men to guard a growing cluster of captives if the battle reignited. I made a decision that has haunted historians and moralists ever since, a decision born.
London greeted me like a man returning from a storm. On the 23rd of November, 1415, I rode through streets packed so tightly with people that the city itself felt like a single living body. Banners of St. George hung from windows, church bells seemed to shake the cold air. Faces looked up at me with something I had not seen in years, confidence, not only in a king, but in the idea that England could win again. Agincourt had become more than a battle. It had become proof. And proof is priceless when your dynasty is still living under whispers of usurper. But the moment the noise faded and the doors of Westminster closed behind me, I knew the truth. A great victory is not the end of a war. It is an opening. And if you don't move through that opening quickly, it closes. So while London celebrated, I returned to maps, ships, and ledgers. I looked at Normandy as if it were a lock waiting for the right key. I looked at the Seine as a road pointing toward Paris, and I looked at France itself, divided, wounded by its own civil conflict, and I thought, this is the moment. Yet even a victorious king cannot simply wish an army into existence twice. The year 1416 tested me in a different way, not with mud and arrows, but with the sea. Supply lines to Calais and the foothold at Harfleur had to be protected, and hostile ships, especially those aligned with France and her allies, threatened the channel routes that kept my war alive. The ocean doesn't care about crowns, it only cares about wind, wood, and timing. While my captains dealt with that danger, another force arrived, one made of diplomacy, ceremony, and enormous expectation. In May 1416, Sigismund came to England, king of the Romans, one of the most influential rulers in Europe, a man who understood that power is often built through alliances as much as battles. I received him with all honor England could offer, not because I enjoyed spectacle for its own sake, but because I needed what Sigismund represented, legitimacy in the eyes of Christendom. He wanted help with the Council of Constance, the effort to end the Great Schism and reunite the Church. I wanted something just as valuable: recognition, respect, and influence against France. The result was the Treaty of Canterbury, signed in August 1416. On parchment, it promised cooperation and friendship. In reality, it gave me something more subtle. It made my campaign look less like an English king chasing private ambition and more like a European king acting within a larger order. That mattered. In the medieval world, the story around a war can be as powerful as the war itself. I also continued to work the French civil conflict like a wedge. Burgundy mattered. John the Fearless mattered. I didn't trust him, but I didn't need to. I only needed him to hesitate, to stay neutral long enough for England to press its advantage. With all that in place, I returned to France in the summer of 1417. This time, I came not to raid, not to march for glory, but to stay. I landed in Normandy and moved with method. I targeted towns and strongpoints the way a craftsman targets joints in a structure. Take the right places, and the whole region begins to lean toward you. Caen fell in September 1417 after a determined siege. It wasn't just a city, it was an anchor. From there, other towns began to open their gates, Bayeux, Lisieux, and more. Each submission was another step in building an English Normandy that could feed itself, defend itself, and support a deeper push. This was not the kind of war that makes songs quickly. It was slower, colder, and more administrative than Agincourt. It was about garrisons, supply depots, repaired walls, and the constant work of turning conquest into control. By early 1418, the coastline still held one stubborn prize, Cherbourg. It took months of pressure to bring it down, but when it finally fell, Normandy's ports were tightening into my grasp. The sea, once a vulnerability, began to look more like a controlled corridor. Then came Rouen, the great lock on the Seine, the capital of Normandy, and one of the strongest cities in northern France. When I began the siege of Rouen in the summer of 1418, I understood exactly what I was attempting. Rouen was not Harfleur. It was larger, richer, and more capable of resistance. It had walls, stores, and pride. But I had something Rouen could not manufacture: time, determination, and a ring of forces that refused to loosen. Siege warfare is not a single day of heroism. It is pressure measured in weeks and months. It is mud, cold winter, sickness, and the dull repetition of work. It is also psychological. Cities do not fall only because walls crack. They fall because hope cracks. Inside Rouen, the hardship became visible. Supplies dwindled. People grew desperate. In a moment that still chills the mind, the city expelled its poorest citizens, old men, women, children, pushing them outside the gates to reduce mouths to feed. Those people were trapped between city and siege, with nowhere to go. I did not open my lines to feed them. If you want to judge me for that, you won't be the first, but understand the logic of the age. If I relieved them, Rouen would learn that starvation could be weaponized against me, push out more, force me to support them, and weaken my own army. Mercy in that moment could have turned into collapse. So I held the line. And on the 19th of January, 1419, Rouen surrendered. With Rouen in my hands, Normandy was effectively conquered. The duchy that had once produced William the Conqueror, who had crossed the Channel and taken England, was now under the authority of an English king again. History had curled back on itself. But conquest alone was not my final aim. I wanted legitimacy so strong that France itself would be forced to accept it. And for that, I needed more than cities. I needed politics. In the spring of 1419, I met French leaders at Moulins on the Seine. It was one of those moments where history feels like a table set for a portrait. Banners, noble pavilions, guarded smiles, and the heavy awareness that every word would echo beyond the room. There, I saw Catherine of France more closely, the woman whose hand I had sought for years as part of my strategy. She was calm,
composed, and unreadable in the way royal daughters often learn to be. In her, I saw a bridge, marriage as a weapon of legitimacy, a way to bind my claim to the French royal line. But the meeting did not deliver peace. The French factions were too divided, too mistrustful. John the Fearless stayed guarded, silent at key moments, and then, behind the scenes, chose his own path. And then, France changed in a single violent turn. In September 1419, John the Fearless was assassinated at Montereau during a meeting with the Dauphin's side. That act did not merely remove a man, it reshaped the entire political map. Burgundy, burning with outrage, turned toward England as the only force strong enough to punish the Dauphin and protect Burgundian interests. Suddenly, the French royal government, broken by madness at the top, split by factions, terrified by English success, moved toward a decision that would have seemed unthinkable just a few years earlier. Negotiations opened again, and this time the terms were extraordinary. I demanded recognition as heir to the French throne, not simply as a claimant to land. I demanded Catherine in marriage. I insisted that Charles VI could remain king in name for life, but that I would act as regent, and that my children would inherit France. And on May 2nd, 1420, the agreement was sealed. The Treaty of Troyes did not end the war, nothing ends that cleanly, but it changed the framework of the war. It declared, in official language, that the future of France would pass through me. Then, on June 2nd, 1420, I married Catherine of France. The ceremony was solemn, not extravagant. It carried the weight of 2 kingdoms and the silence of everyone who understood the cost of what had been signed. By December 1420, I entered Paris. Winter lay over the city, gray light on wet stone, banners hanging from towers. Paris was not just a prize, it was a symbol. To ride through its gates as regent and heir was to stand at the peak of everything my campaign had been built to achieve. And yet, even then, I could feel the truth beneath the triumph. France was not fully mine. The Dauphin still resisted, cities still wavered, alliances were still fragile, and England's patience, England's money, was not endless. So as I